I spent 4 years here from 1997 to 2001, 4 very happy years, and I met a lot of friends who are still friends of mine, and I'm glad to see some of them in the audience. I just wanted to mention how I met Roy and how I met Lou. The way I met Roy, we were co-authoring maybe 15 or 20 articles. Come on, I'm going to give demerits if you don't sit over here. Get up here. Come on, you rotten kids. Get up here. You with the gray shirt. Come on, move up. There's plenty of seating room here. What happened is Roy and I published, maybe 20 or 30 articles in the 4 years that I was here. And typically, he would start off with logic and facts, as you saw his talk, and I would sort of do the ranting and raving, which I'll start in a minute, after you people get up here and sit over there. I'm not going to talk until you do it, so come on, get over here. There's seating. Sometimes the referees of the journals we'd send it to would say, well, the first half of this article is wonderful, it's logical, it's reasonable. The last half is written by a nut, and we'll accept the first half and not the second. But we always stuck through, and we published all the things we started together. The way I met Lou is, the way Roy and I would work is we would sort of shift an article back and forth until we got it right. And one time Roy shifted an article, and there was this guy, Lou Harden, and I was just here a year and I'd never heard of him, so I said to Roy, well, who is he? And nowadays you don't have to ask who Lou Harden is. I think he's pretty well known, but in those days, at least for a person from the north, well, I was from South Brooklyn, so I had a kinship with this place. Everyone knows him now. Okay, after I've whined and got you all to move up a little bit. Aren't you people enjoying those? Yes, you see, they're very happy there. Okay, what I'm now going to do is start my talk, and I'm going to make the case for privatizing public education. If I had my druthers, there would be no public school left standing, whether at the elementary school or the middle school or the university, and all of it would be privatized. It would be as private as bubblegum or wristwatches or rubber bands. So what I'm going to do is start off by making the general case for privatization of anything and then apply it to education. Well, what's the case for privatization? The case for privatization is two: morality and economic efficiency. Morality, in the private market, you deal in a voluntary basis. You buy bubblegum, and they don't charge you for bubblegum unless you get the bubblegum. Whereas in the public sector, it's not voluntary. You have to pay for it through taxes. And if you think that taxes are voluntary, wait till April 15th and try not paying and see what happens to you. Now, it might be that government is a necessary evil. I don't believe it, but many people do, and therefore we need some taxes. But it's a necessary evil. It's evil to coerce people into doing things. And don't think that it's voluntary because, we all agree to be part of this U.S. government club. It wasn't unanimous when we started the government of the United States in 1776. It was a majority vote. Well, what about the minority? Their rights were violated. The second reason is economic efficiency. We, as consumers, have much more control over producers in the market than we do as voters have over people running for office. For example, in the market, you vote every day. In the government, in the politics, you vote once every 4 years. In the market, you can vote very sharply focus your vote. You can vote for a red tie or a blue tie. Whereas in the political sphere, you might like, the choices you'll have, candidate A will have policies 2, 4, 6, and 8 that you like, and candidate B will have 1, 3, 5, and 7, and it's a package deal. You've got to pick A or B. You have no way to indicate, well, I like policy 5 on this and policy 6 on that. No way to do it. There's also such a thing as rational voter ignorance. No vote is ever, in the political sphere, has ever been settled by one vote. So what incentive do you have to vote at all? And what incentive do you have to learn anything about these things? Whereas if you don't learn about a car or a motorcycle that you buy, you don't patronize Consumer Reports or what have you, you pay for it. Whereas if you vote for a lousy politician, you personally don't pay for it. So the whole sphere is less efficient. Could you put on the first one? One indication of this is in the Soviet Union under collectivized farming. They had private land, the houses in front of and in back of the peons' houses, and the land was 3%, and they produced 25% of the crops, whereas the collectivized farms were 97% of the land, and they only produced 75% of the crops. Or take another example, one dear and near to me, close to my heart as a New Orleanian. What about FEMA? What about the Army Corps of Engineers? Between those two, they really did to New Orleans what you wouldn't want to have done to your worst enemy. Now, I don't mind that people make mistakes. People make mistakes all over. To be human is to make a mistake. What I really mind is that there was no weeding out of the inefficiency. Those people are still in business. Isn't that horrible? Whereas if a pizza place or a rich place screwed up royally, they'd go broke and we'd have fewer of them to contend with. And from such a process of weeding out the inefficient, you get more efficiency. Okay, that's the general case for privatization of anything. What's the case for privatization of education? Well, you weed out inefficient schools. Some schools are good, some schools are bad. If the bad schools can go bankrupt, the average school remaining will be a little bit better. Education will be improved. Private education is cheaper. Whenever they've done studies of how much does it cost to do something privately or publicly, you get a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 rule. A very easy case, because the tasks are very homogeneous, is garbage removal. It costs 2 to 3 times as much, 100 to 200% more to do it publicly than to do it privately. In many places, private education costs $2,000 or $3,000 a year per kid in the elementary school, whereas it costs up to $10,000 in many jurisdictions for public school. Why? Well, they have many more administrators. They're just top heavy with administrators, and there's no weeding out. If you have a bad private school, it's gone. People don't patronize it. Another one is that private education solves all sorts of problems that are intractable when you have public schools, because when you have public schools, it's a one-size-fits-all for everybody. For example, should we have Afrocentric education? I don't know. But if the rule is that everybody has to have it or nobody has it, well, then you can't fit the tastes of consumers. What about dress codes? What about pregnant girls? Should you kick them out of school, or as a signal that you don't want young girls to get pregnant, or should you be nice to them? I don't know the answers to these things, but I do know that if we had private schooling, different schools would find different choices on these issues, and different people could be satisfied, just like we have many types of cars and many kinds of shirts. If you have a one-size-fits-all, you don't satisfy consumers. Here's a quote from Sarkozy, the French Prime Minister, quote, "Every fifth grader will have to learn the life story of one of the 11,000 French children of Jewish descent killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust." Unquote. Every kid in France is going to have to learn the history of one kid in France who perished, who was Jewish in the Nazi Holocaust. Well, is this a good idea? I don't know. It's sort of like, if everybody has to have vanilla ice cream and nobody can get chocolate, we're not going to satisfy people. Now, some people want their children to learn this, other people don't want it, but every school in France, every public school in France is going to have to do that. The benefit that I'm trying to get at of private schooling is that you can have your choice. Then you have special interests, teachers' unions. They have a contempt for the family. They think of parents as, people to be pushed around like people on a chessboard or chess pieces on the board. Homeschooling. What about homeschooling? Well, I favor homeschooling, and homeschooling has been, Greg Kasa gave some information that shows that homeschooling is increasing in Arkansas. By the way, I want to thank Greg Kasa and his Arkansas Policy Organization for setting up this very interesting panel. But it's a violation of specialization and division of labor. We don't have home clothing manufacturers. To me, homeschooling is an indication of just how bad public schooling is. If we didn't have public schooling and we had private schooling, there would be much less of a need for homeschooling. So I'm in favor of homeschooling. 2 minutes? Wow, I've got a lot more. Well, why don't you do the next one? What about the poor? That's the second objection. No, that's the other one. Not that one. The one before that? A different one. The one that says public and private? You can't get good help nowadays. Nope. An entirely different.
This one.
That's it. Good. What I'm trying to do is say, how do we handle the poor with regard to food? Do we have a public groceries? Do we have public restaurants? No, we don't. How about clothing? No, we only have private ones. I check off when we have private. With regard to shelter, we have both, but public housing is a disgrace, is a disaster. And we do it with education. We have public and private education. And I think that we ought to get rid of it. We should only have checks on the right side as an answer to the question, what about the poor? Now the next slide. The economic argument for public education is the one called external economies. And what you have here is you have an ordinary supply and demand curve, and that indicates the actual amount of public education or the actual amount of education that you're going to get. What these people, these anti-market people are saying is that the actual amount of education is not sufficient. What we should have is the optimal amount, and the optimal amount comes by hitting the supply curve and the demand curve to the right, which indicates that the optimal amount of education is greater than the actual amount. Why? Well, the first demand curve, the one to the left, indicates the private reasons for getting education, to learn more, to get a better job, things like that. The other one indicates the public, so-called public benefits, that if you go to school, you'll benefit me because you'll be a better voter, you'll be more intelligent, you'll be less likely to be a criminal, things like that. Well, in my view, this is very silly. I don't see why childless people should be made to pay for other people's children to go to school. I don't think that the other people's children are any better for it. Indeed, most of what goes on in higher education, at least in my experience, is things like multiculturalism, feminism, black studies, queer studies, relativism, egalitarianism, which makes you less able to vote well. It's no accident that rent control, which is an indication of economic illiteracy, is most popular in places like Cambridge, Mass., Santa Monica, Ann Arbor, and Berkeley. Well, what do those four places have in common? A lot of college students who are miseducated by these, they have diversity, and what diversity in most sociology departments consists of is a black Marxist, a feminist Marxist, a gay Marxist, a transgendered Marxist, a lesbian Marxist, just Marxists. Or sometimes the diversity has, have a Marxist, a Maoist, a Fabian, environmental socialist, a Trotskyite, a Mentionite, a Bolshevik, a union organizer, and that's the division of... I'll take 30 more seconds, just finish. On vouchers, vouchers are a great idea. They bring some competition, but imagine we only had government restaurants. Then the competition would just be between government restaurants. We want to have widespread public education. Some people say, well, we've always had public education. Not true. We've had public education only since the 1890s. Before that, people did fine without it. I'm out of time, so I have to go, but thanks for your attention.
Lesson plans are becoming more important than the actual teaching of the children. I've seen that, and it's a sad thing. I'd like to ask also a question about the private schools. Would you have the students pay for the private schools, or how would that be funded, and how would the equity of education for all students be allowed in the private education system?
John. Is this on? Yeah, I guess it is. To me, there are two parts of equity. One is not forcing people to pay for other people's education. That seems more like theft to me than equity. With regard to poor students paying for it, look, poor people get food, but yet we don't have any public food places. We don't have any public restaurants. We don't have any public grocery stores. What we say to the poor is, look, poor, here's money. Go buy food. What we say to them with regard to clothing is, poor, here's money, go buy clothing. This idea that you need public schools, otherwise only the aristocracy is going to be educated, I think is erroneous. Surely we could put education on the same footing as we put food and clothing. You don't see poor people running around with no clothing. You don't see them starving in this country. Not that I favor welfare, but that's a whole other issue. What I'm trying to say here is that just pure education to help the poor, you don't need public provision. You can have public finance of it, namely the way we do it with food and clothing. With regard to quality of education, most of these spelling bees, who they're winning by? The 12-year-old kids, their spelling bees, they're almost always won by homeschooling or private schooling, not by public schooling. This idea of we have to have professionals, we have to worry about these mid-level bureaucrats. Well, it seems to me that public schooling, whether charter schooling or vouchers or anything else, is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Look, we don't have any weeding out process. If there were a mid-level bureaucrat screwing up a pizza parlor, that pizza parlor would go broken, and it wouldn't bother us anymore. But if we have public schooling, we'll never get rid of these mid-level bureaucrats that are screwing things up and making teachers do lesson plans instead of teach. The way to get rid of this is to privatize. We rely on private industry for food, clothing, shelter, for cars, for vacations. Why not for this too? There's nothing unique about education that makes it different, that somehow we have to have socialized education. This is just socialism, and I'm against socialism.
We have our next question here.
To the same gentleman, when you have private schools in mind, is it profit or non-profit?
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
When you say private schools, is it for profit or non-profit?
Either way, both would be private.
Sheldon Buxton, visiting professor in school education. We're new to campus, and this question is for President Hardin. I solely support the concept on the charter school as a necessity that's emerged because of bureaucracies. My question, sir, in reference to K-12, do you see the application the same for higher education?
First, it's good to have you on our campus. We are expanding our visiting professors, and it helps our students get an entirely new perspective. So welcome to our campus. And the answer is yes. As a matter of fact, interestingly enough, to answer your question, now, it will not be to the degree K through 12. The question is, do I see charter schools in higher ed as well? My former job before coming here was 6 years as director of the Department of Higher Ed. The previous president here, Dr. Wynn Thompson, came to my office and asked if UCA could become the first charter school, and his purpose was to offer doctorates. He was going to make it a doctoral institution and offer quite a few doctorates. We have 4 now. At the time, it was the bureaucratic process. We had to approve the doctorates. And I said, Dr. Thompson, we'll look at it, we'll examine it. It never developed, but at least he approached me. So yes, I do think that we will eventually see some charter schools at the higher ed level concept.
Hi, I have a follow-up to what you were saying earlier. I'm Jessica Rucker, I'm an accounting major here at UCA. You were comparing it to food and clothing for the poor, but don't poor people eat worse food than us? Are health, disease, and problems more common among poor people? What about the quality of education? Isn't it going to be worse among poor people because they can't afford to pay for those better schools? That's kind of the thing that I've always heard is the problem with these schools that you're talking about is better level of quality education focuses more where rich people are and poor people kind of get the shaft on that. Also, another point, public education, the kind of concept I have is that you're talking about how people have to pay for other children's education, but isn't public education kind of an investment in our country? These children are going to be the leaders. That to make our country greater. It's not just about what you're paying for your own child.
Well, I think our country would fall apart if we didn't have food and clothing. And yet we don't have to have public food and public clothing. So I don't see why our country will fall apart if we don't have public education. We could have private education. We could have on-the-job training. For many years, we had apprenticeship programs. There are a lot of people, young people in school now, who are forced to be in school and who don't like school and regard this as a 12-year jail sentence for innocent people. They'd be much better off out there working and learning something on the job than education. Education isn't for everyone, despite the fact that many people here seem to think it is because that's their profession. With regard to poor people getting the shaft, of course poor people get the shaft. That's why it's not good to be poor. And if they didn't get the shaft, why would anyone want to become rich? Look, suppose we had a proportional price system. A proportional price system means that a poor guy pays a penny for a loaf of bread, a middle-class person such as us pay $3 for bread, and Bill Gates pays $100,000 for a loaf of bread. And at the end of the day, we each get the exact amount of bread, whether you're rich or poor. There's no point of being rich. Look, there's no point of being rich. Why are people struggling? Why are people, you take a lot of incentive away. And you also get into socialism. You get into outright starvation. What I'm trying to say is that if we Sovietize our economy, and this is nothing but the Sovietization of our economy, we're going to have a Soviet economy. We're going to have starvation like they have in North Korea. Now, happily, we don't apply it to everything. But why should we apply it to education? Why should we apply it to any one thing when private is more moral and more efficient? Now, it doesn't mean that the poor, look, if you get, right now, to go to a private school, it's like $3,000 or $4,000. To go to a public school, the cost of it is more like $10,000. It's much cheaper. Now, suppose we just said, okay, everybody who has a kid gets $10,000 or $5,000, whatever it is. Now, of course, Bill Gates' kid is going to have more. They're going to have better books. They're going to have tutors. They're going to have whatever. What are you going to do? Tell Bill Gates or very rich people that they can't educate their kid? What I'm trying to say, see, there are really two problems here. One is the rich-poor, which is an entirely different issue and deserves a seminar of its own. The other is just privatizing education. There's no need to privatize education to get poor people a good education. Their voucher or their fee or whatever it is, if you give them $7,000 or $10,000 and say this has to be spent on education, now you go to any private school you want to, well, I think that would solve the problem, just as it solves the problem of food. Okay, so the poor don't get the best clothing or they don't get much jewelry or whatever it is, but so what?
Yeah, questions up?
This question is for President Horton. Earlier when you were speaking, you said in order to improve education, we have to be willing to take a risk and do something different. And then you also said that you didn't like the voucher system and kind of because it hadn't been tried enough. So why can't we take a risk with vouchers?
The question is, and I do firmly believe we have to take risks, i.e. charter schools. Charter schools, let me just tell you this. I chaired the Senate Education Committee, and back then, charter schools were, we couldn't get it through. Back then it was tough, and it was, over a few years, people like Senator Jim Argue, strong public educators helped, and it had its day. And charter schools, again, 12, 14 years ago, you wouldn't have seen that. So we are taking some risks. We're going to have to take a lot more. Certainly, I believe that we need to look at anything. The problem with vouchers is everywhere, it's not like we don't have examples. There were 6 states that actually tried vouchers in some form or fashion, and in most cases they were ineffective. And again, there were problems of they were given the money directly. The government gave the money to the school. When you do that, it was a violation of church and state. It was establishment of religion. So everywhere they've tried it, they've failed. Now, should we look at an alternate form? Certainly, I'm open to anything. But I still pretty firmly, at this point, if I were running for office and answered a question directly, which I haven't seen yet in this presidential election, and they asked, would you favor vouchers? My answer would be a definitive no still.
Yes, this is for Dr. Boyd Whitehead. At the beginning of the presentation, you said something about how some schools get to discriminate based on race. They say, okay, no, we already have too many people of this race. What's the reasoning behind that? Why would that be an issue at all? I don't understand.
Okay, a question about what happens, of course, in order to comply with some court orders generally, that there has to be a certain racial balance in different schools. A lot of it's based on the fact that the school in the past has been held to intentionally discriminate against African Americans, for example. What the cases are starting to hold, and this starts back with the Michigan case, is that if you base decisions about where you assign an individual student based solely on his or her race, that violates the Equal Protection Clause. No state shall deprive any citizen of the equal protection of laws. Now, what the cases have held is that if the state uses some other factors, like economic status, or now race can be one factor, but economic status, where the person is from, what their high school grade point was, what background they have, whether they can play the oboe, all kinds of things. The court says, and this, by the way, is 5-4 decision in the Seattle case, and the senators would allow you to use race solely as a discriminating factor. But the majority said, and Justice Kennedy's kind of swing vote, as he is on everything else, apparently, right now. So the problem is if you base your decisions based solely on race, it's likely that if the case ever gets to the Supreme Court again, they'd follow the precedent that violates the Equal Protection Clause. So probably what the legislature is going to do in Arkansas next year, and I'm can't speak for them, but what they're probably going to do is they're probably going to add some additional factors in there besides race in determining whether students can be transferred to the school choice program. I hope that's sort of an answer. Okay. Sorry.
I have a question for Mr. Block. You're comparing food, shelter, and clothing to education, and those are necessities. What if education is a luxury item, like a boat, where people don't have boats? So, and I could be wrong, but it's my understanding that primary education helps our nation's productivity. So how do you, if poor people don't choose primary education at all, then how do you solve that?
Well, if they're given $10,000 to spend on this, and they're told they can only spend it on that, it's hard to see how they would spend it on anything else. Particularly if you had compulsory school laws, namely the parents went to jail if they didn't send their kids to school. Not that I favor that, but if you had that, that problem would end. Look, Packard, Nash Rambler, DeSoto, these are all car companies that went broke. Presumably, these were the car companies that couldn't compete for the consumer dollar. Is the car industry better off or worse off from the fact that if you don't do well in the car industry, you have to go broke and you have to leave the room for car companies that do well? This is what free enterprise is. This is what capitalism is. This is what competition is all about. This is why we have a pretty good car industry, now including Honda and Toyota and stuff like that, who did a better job. You see, the problem with the charter schools and these bureaucrats is you're not going to get a good education system unless you can weed them out, unless unless firms, educational firms that have them, have to go broke. But if they don't, if they stay, no matter whether they do a good job or not, look, there were professionals in Rambler, DeSoto, and Packard. There were professionals in FEMA and in the Army Corps of Engineers. That's not the key. The key is there exit? Is there bankruptcy? Is there a room for elimination of failure so that we can have more success? That's the way you get better education. Yes, education is an investment in the country in some metaphorical sense, but so is everything else. If we don't have food, clothing, and shelter, we're not going to have much of an economy either.
We have a question back, and then in the front.
I come from a poor family and poor background, and my mother made my clothes when I was little. A lot of my stuff I had was hand-me-downs, was not paid by someone else, and my grandparents had a small farm, and they helped supplement our food and other stuff. My family had to budget. They had 25 cents left over at the end of the month, but that was extra. Everything was budgeted. But I happen to live in a community here in Conway who have, because of the taxpayers, we have a good public education system, and I am here because of my intellect. I was able to get scholarships based on taxes. So if that system was not in place for me, I could not be here where I am today. And I would not. I'm pursuing a field of education because I want to be a person who can educate our young people. And that system is not in place. How are we to do this? And how could I have been here?
Well, congratulations to you and your family. I think you're an example for us all. It's because of people like you that we have as good a country as we have, that people work hard and save and prosper. But we would have scholarships in private education too. There's Catholic education, there's all sorts of private religious education. They give scholarships. Look, do you know how public education came in as a matter of history? The way, and this isn't going to make me popular here because this is more of a Protestant area than a Catholic area, but public education was an attack on Catholics by Protestants. What happened is that it came about in the 1890s or the 1900s, and it came about as a result of immigration from places like Italy and Ireland, where there were a lot of Catholics. And the Protestants didn't much like the idea that they were setting up Catholic schools, and they were promoting popery or papery or whatever it is that was seen as evil. So what they did is they knew economics. They weren't moral, but they knew economics, and they knew that demand curve sloped downward, and they knew that the higher the price, the less of something you'll get. So what they did is they said, okay, Catholics, you want to have private education? You're going to pay for it twice. Once you're going to pay for it in your own private education, and second, you're going to pay for it in taxes for our kids. So this idea that public education sort of walks on water and is holy and is beyond reproach and is highly moral, I think that's a highly problematic thesis. The history shows that it was an attack on Catholics by Protestants, and I'm neither, so I have no dog in this horse race or horse in this race or whatever it is. But this is a matter of historical fact. Public education came about as a result of very nefarious motivations. And people in this audience that, I'm attacking public education, and you sort of think I'm, attacking goodness or something. I'm not attacking goodness. This is not good. And there's no such thing as, there's no such thing as, we shouldn't be calling it public education, but we should be calling it a socialist education, because that's what it is. This is socialism. And I'm against socialism.
In the back here.
I just want to thank the panelists for their time. I have a question for President Hardin. You mentioned that you don't believe that the bureaucracy is a very effective way of handling education, but so as a political science major, I agree that bureaucracy is very unruly, but how do we streamline the bureaucracy for a publicly funded education when the state of Arkansas, when the legislature passed legislation that centralized the standards and accountability, took that ability from the school district and put it into the state education department? How do we streamline it if the powers need to be centralized in Little Rock instead of the local school districts across the state?
That is an excellent question. The question is, if I've got concerns about too much bureaucracy, how do we streamline what has appeared to be a centralization in Little Rock over the past few years? And let me answer that twofold. First of all, the fact that the state has set some standards and centralized accountability is good. We literally have to have some accountability. The districts that have been held in academic and fiscal distress, let me tell you, I've studied this, I get reports on this. The state's been, get tough on bureaucracy, now I'm going to be very favorable. The people that have made these decisions have given these districts every possibility. They've let them go to the brink of the canyon before they've shut the school down, or actually don't shut it down, they put it in with another school district. So the bureaucracy and centralization is good. We've got to have someone to hold accountable. My problem is not the necessary centralization and accountability. I like that. It's the fact that we have people that are coming up with regulation after regulation, and we have more regulations now than we've ever had in the history of the state on public education, and the regulations for regulation's sake. And it is choking. That's the bureaucracy. Not requiring a good result out here. It's the regulations that are there to justify the job of whoever came up with the regulation. And so what do we streamline? We take, we come up with if I was back in the Senate, and I did this when I was there, but I would have a bill that would require a couple hundred regs to be eliminated every year. Oh my gosh, we could probably eliminate 200 to 300 regs a year. We need to teach, one final thing, we need to start treating our teachers as professionals. Yeah, let's look. Our teachers shouldn't have to be X out on the playground this amount of time. They ought to be teachers. And the principals, the superintendents need to treat them as professionals. And I'm not sure we're doing that from a state, and I'm not sure we're doing it as a nation. So those are the bureaucracies, those are the regs. I think we've only got 5 minutes, so I think, Georgia, did you have a question? And I think Mr. Wood.
Yes, sir, I did. This is for either President Hardin or Dr. Whitehead. I'm a staff member here, a student here, but I'm going to ask this question as a parent because I have an elementary school student and also a high school student on college track, which is a new program that's available for high school students. I'm worried about the benchmark programs and the testing. I know that whenever they have to do the benchmark programs or they have the testing coming up, they send home letters that your child has to be prepared, these are the items that you have to study, and make sure that your child has slept, eats a really good balanced meal in the morning, and then send them to school. I'm worried that the teachers are taking this benchmark testing to an extreme because from what I heard from my sister who's a science professor in Texas, that they have a totally different test, by the way, but their job security is
determined by the benchmark of that school and in their classroom. Is that true, or is this something that, I mean, I really don't know. I'm really concerned about this test. Are they just teaching the test, or are they really teaching what needs to be taught in those classes?
I can't tell you if they're teaching a test or not, but talking to the teachers who teach my granddaughters, yes, that's a major part of their evaluation, is how the students do on the benchmark. And I don't know whether they actually teach the test or not, because I'm not in there, but there's major pressure on the teachers, and as President Hardin said, maybe I'll let the teachers have a little more say in that than the administration has.
Okay, the other question is classification. If your child in elementary school does not do well, are they automatically, because I know that there's a new SIT program, SIT, I'm not sure exactly what it stands for because I just became aware of it myself as a parent. Do they automatically classify your student as, and does that follow your student throughout the whole curriculum? I mean, I'm not sure how that works.
No, no, it doesn't. And they have some latitude. They have some latitude. The answer is no, it won't follow. Basically, I don't want to oversimplify this. Basically, what's going to follow them is 9th grade through 12th grade. And that's pretty much going to be it. And there is even some latitude at the elementary level. I think we have time for one final question here. Or we got two? Okay. Okay.
Dr. Arden,
yes.
If the pie is too small because mostly the bureaucrats are eating up the resources instead of the teachers, why are we increasing the pie instead of getting rid of the bureaucrats?
Well, that's a very, very good question, and the answer is they are eliminating the bureaucrats. Administratively, part of the Lakeview decision was you're going to have to reevaluate your administration. There were some schools that had 8 or 9 associate superintendents, and literally they did. So they are headed in the right direction, and it did actually mention, Lakeview did reference administration heavy. So that's good. Good question. I think we had one more over here.
I'm Charles Wood. I'm the president of the Pulaski County School Board, so I'm really interested in this. I'd like to comment first on Dr. Whitehead and Lou, the talk about the bureaucracy, and a young man in the back asked about the racial question. I want to give you a real live example of how stupid the bureaucracy can be sometimes. There's a man that lives in our school district, a black man, married to a white woman, and had a daughter that went to North Little Rock schools. Got in there several years ago. Had a son that just started school this year, and they wanted him to be in the same school with his sister. It was simple enough, right? It makes sense. The problem was that the racial quotas, which were being enforced more stringently now, wouldn't let his son transfer. Now you think that, oh gosh, well he ought to have it made, because half black, half white, he can be whatever he wants to be. And he can be. He can qualify to be black or white. Except if he chooses to be white, he can't leave the school he's in. And if he chooses to be black, he can't go to the school he needs to go to. So that is an example of where regulations and bureaucracy can really do things, personal things to people that really hurt. To Professor Block, I'd like to say I'm close to a libertarian too, so I can identify with a lot of the things you said. But it seems to me that President Hardin's combination of public schools and charter schools gets us almost where we want to be. It allows the freedom that you want with the public school benefits that the young woman back here wants. And I think I have this last question, maybe for President Hardin. your example about the pies was great. The equal slices and the larger pie. I see that there's one more issue here, though, and would like your comment on it. It seems that what we're doing in America now is not only judging that we get equal slices of the pie, but whether the people that are eating their slices of pie are equally satisfied. One guy may be 220 pounds, or he may have not eaten in 7 days, and he may see himself as hungrier, so he may really want a bigger piece of the pie. And somebody like me that definitely doesn't look underfed may not get his piece of the pie, or at least an equal size piece of the pie, because somebody has perceived that person over here needs a larger piece. And if he gets a larger piece, I get a smaller piece. And it all leads me, and you might expect this from school people, but one of the things I like to say, riles people up sometimes, because the purpose may be good, but when you have no child left behind, if you really believe that, what that means is no child gets ahead. Because somebody's behind. Thanks.
Well, Charlie Wood, thank you for serving as president of the Pulaski County School Board. That's an important district, and we appreciate your being here as well as everyone. This is a huge issue nationally, obviously. The answer to the question is the Supreme Court and the state, we have not arrived on the definition of equity yet. It's a moving target, and it has been interpreted. Some schools have different variables, so the answer to your question is, I don't believe we're there yet on equity. And for the very precise reason that you stated, everyone has a different perception. I will say we've moved closer to equity and through millages than we've ever have, but we're not there yet. And your example is a good example. Someone that we haven't recognized, I'm certainly going to have Walter Block back. He is one of the nation's probably premier writers in the libertarian area, actually one of the top in the nation, so it's good to have him on the panel. I'll turn it back over to Greg, but please give the Arkansas Policy Foundation and Greg a hand.
We want to answer their questions.
Okay.
Questions at this time?
Real quick.
Sure.
Go ahead, please. No, I'm okay.
The problem with Lou Hardin is that
I have to give the mic back to Lou.
he is a horrible example for my case. Namely, he is an example of a very, very successful entrepreneur in education who's done a magnificent job. I left here in 2001, and I've read nothing but about him and how wonderfully he's done with this school. The problem is not with him, the problem is with the system. Will his successor be half as good as him? Probably not. Will he be pretty good? Who knows? The point is that if he's not, we don't have any automatic mechanism to get rid of him. Look, this gentleman asked about charter schools. Well, why not charter restaurants, charter groceries, charter cars, charter shoes? We don't need that. We have free enterprise for that. Why can't we have free enterprise for this? We can't count on Lou Hardin's. If we could, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government and we wouldn't need police. And if all public educators were like Lou Hardin, we wouldn't need private schools either.
I'd like to again thank all of you for attending this forum. We're a nonprofit organization, the Policy Foundation. We're online if you're curious about our work. We're in our 14th year. And in March next month, we'll host Governor Beebe at the Peabody. He's going to come and speak to us about the grocery tax. And thank you again for coming today.